Hello everyone, and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. Sheila's decision to abduct Taylor unfolds as a suffocating, grim curl of intent and consequence, a single night stretched into an emotional ocean where every alternate presses heavier than the last, and from the first moment her resoluteness hardens. There's a sense that commodity irrevocable has been set in stir. Because this isn't an impulsive catch and run but a calculated crossing of a moral line that Sheila has circled for times, persuading herself that despair is defense and that love, fear, resentment, and control can be pleaded together into unreason. And as Taylor is allured into the quiet, deceptively warm space of the bed and breakfast, the ordinary details, the creak of floorboards, the muted beacon gleam, the smell of soap and old wood, come complicit in the act, bearing substantiation to the moment. Sheila's precisely masked insecurity sharpens into action, and when she strikes, nippy and shocking, it feels less like violence than treason, the kind that collapses the world inward, because Taylor's trust is the true armament. Sheila steals first, leaving Taylor stupefied, confused, and floundering to attune the familiar face before them with the cold perfection now unfolding, and as the hijacking takes hold the cerebral terrain becomes as chastising as the physical, with Sheila interspersing between frantic tender-heartedness and nipping detachment, her words discovering out in apologies that sound rehearsed indeed to herself. Averring that this is necessary, that Taylor will understand, that everything will make sense once the chaos settles, yet indeed as she speaks her hands fluctuate, betraying the cracks in her resoluteness, while Taylor's fear manifests not as riots but as a deep, destabilizing shock that drains color from the room, because Taylor senses incontinently that this isn't a script governed by reason, and that knowledge alone is enough to tire strength from their branches, and as Sheila restrains and transports Taylor, the world outside blurs into stripes of light and shadow, each passing corner a memorial of how snappily normal life can be left before, how fluently a person can be cancelled from their own routine, and when they arrive at the insulated setting where Sheila intends to keep Taylor, the silence there's rough, thick with unsolicited questions and implied pitfalls, and it's in this silence that Taylor begins to collapse, not dramatically, not all at formerly, but in supplements, as adrenaline burns off and the body registers the trauma it has endured, heart racing, breath shoal, muscles pulsing under the weight of fear and unbelief, while Sheila, watching this deterioration, is brazened with the physical reality of what she has done, because no fantasy ever reckoned for the way a mortal body shuts down under terror, the way strength leaks out through sweat-soaked skin and unfocused eyes, and the collapse becomes ineluctable, a confluence of fear, prostration, and shock that leaves Taylor slightly suitable to remain upright, sliding down walls, heaving for air, vision narrowing as the room tilts, and in that moment Sheila's power feels suddenly fragile, because control over another person doesn't grant control over consequences, and she's forced to choose between doubling down on atrocity or admitting the damage she has foisted. Yet indeed this choice is muddied by her own unraveling psyche, which reframes Taylor's collapse as both evidence of vulnerability and defense for prison, telling herself that Taylor is safer than, that the outside world is too harsh, that this breakdown proves how important Taylor needs her, and so she hovers between concern and computation, offering water with one hand while tensing tropical chains with the other, and as Taylor drifts in and out of knowledge, studies scrap into images and sensations the scrape of fabric, the echo of Sheila's voice, the pounding of blood and cognizance, and time loses consonance, getting a smear of moments where survival is reduced to breathing, to staying awake, to holding on to the certainty that this is wrong and must end, while Sheila paces, rationalizes, remembers, her own recollections bleeding into the present as she recalls every perceived slight, every moment she felt abandoned or overlooked, weaving them into a narrative where this hijacking is the ineluctable climax of a story in which she has always been the victim, and the bed and breakfast twist adds a subcast of cruel irony, because a place meant for rest and retreat becomes a point of terror, its antique decor mocking the brutality of what's passing within its walls, flowery patterns and polished wood framing a mortal being breaking down under the weight of prison, and as the hours stretch on, Taylor's collapse deepens, body rising, head lolling, the will to repel dulled by fatigue and fear, yet beneath that collapse there's a core of defiance, a quiet turndown to let Sheila's narrative come reality, and that pressure, the visible weakness paired with unnoticeable adaptability, gnaws at Sheila, who senses that no matter how broken Taylor appears, commodity essential remains out of reach, commodity that cannot be abducted or constrained, and this consummation feeds SHEILA's volatility, causing her moods to swing more hectically, her words to edge, her need for confirmation to consolidate. Demanding gratefulness, understanding, indeed affection from someone she has just traumatized, and when Taylor cannot give this, slightly suitable to respond at each, the imbalance becomes stark, exposing the emptiness at the heart of SHEILA's plan, because it in turn cannot fill the void that led to the crime in the first place, and so the scene becomes a study in collapse on both sides. Taylor's physical and emotional arrestment imaged by SHEILA's moral and cerebral decomposition. 2. Circles clustering in a space charged with fear and ineluctability, and as dawn threatens to break, light percolating into corners of the room, illuminating the fate of the night's violence, the reality of the situation presses in harder than ever, because daylight brings clarity, and clarity brings the necessary verity that SHEILA has crossed a line from which there's no easy return, and Taylor, drooped and shaking, embodies the cost of that crossing, a living testament to how snappily trust can be destroyed and how profoundly the mortal body and mind reply when autonomy is stripped down. And indeed, if Taylor survives this collapse, indeed if deliverance or escape ultimately comes, the imprint of this moment will loiter, etched into memory and muscle, while SHEILA, whether she admits it or not, will carry the knowledge that in trying to claim someone differently, she has irreversibly lost herself, and this nipping twist at the heart of the story lies not just in the act of hijacking but in the quiet fate, in the image of a person broken down on a bottom that was meant for comfort, and another standing over them, eventually forced to defy the monstrous shape of her own need, realizing too late that control is end connection, that possession is end love, and that formerly a line like this is crossed, collapse is end an anomaly but an ineluctable consequence. In the fragile hours that follow Taylor's collapse, the atmosphere inside the insulated space shifts from acute chaos into commodity quieter and further unsettling, a suspended state where every sound feels amplified and every movement carries consequence, and SHEILA, no longer fueled purely by adrenaline, is forced to sit with what she has done rather than overrun it, watching Taylor's casket rise and fall in shallow, uneven breaths, counting them without realizing she's doing so, because the stillness terrifies her further than resistance ever could, and in that stillness she begins to understand that this is no longer a fantasy she can recite her way through, but a living, breathing exigency shaped by mortal limits she cannot negotiate with or deny, and as Taylor sluggishly stirs, knowledge returning in fractions rather than a clean awakening, the body responds first, muscles paining, throat raw, head pounding with a dull pressure that makes each study feel heavy and slow, and the simple act of opening their eyes feels like wading up through thick water, vision swimming before fastening just enough to fate the strange ceiling, the wrong light, the wrong silence, and with that recognition comes a swell of fear that the weakened body cannot completely express, heart racing without the strength to match it with movement, breath hitching as fear harpoons again, driving another surge of dizziness that forces Taylor to close their eyes, artificially entwining inward, conserving what little energy remains, while SHEILA reacts with a confusion of impulses, relief that Taylor is awake, sweat that they might try to escape, guilt stoned by the visible risk of the night, and a deep, nearly jejune need to be seen as commodity other than a villain, and so she speaks too important, filling the air with explanations that land like static, averring that Taylor swooned from stress, that they just need rest, that everything will be okay now. Her voice swimming between soothing and protective, as though she's trying to move herself as much as the person on the bottom, yet Taylor hears enough through the haze to understand that SHEILA is reframing the collapse, minimizing it, grinding down the edges of reality so it fits her internal story, and this consummation, indeed further than the physical pain, hardens commodity inside Taylor, because it confirms that SHEILA isn't simply panicked or deceived but laboriously rewriting events to avoid responsibility, and that knowledge becomes an anchor, a grim clarity that cuts through the fog of prostration, telling Taylor that survival will bear not just abidance but alert, and mindfulness that SHEILA's perception of what's passing cannot be trusted, and as the morning creeps forward, the light exposing dust in the air and the mundane details of the room, the situation becomes both further real and more surreal, because daylight strips down the cinematic darkness and replaces it with the trope of detriment, showing a person drooped against a wall, wrists marked, clothes rumpled, eyes ringed with prostration, and another person swimming too near, interspersing between swimming concern and invasive propinquity, and this discrepancy deepens the cerebral strain, making it harder for Sheila to sustain the vision that this is temporary or justified, while making it clearer to Taylor that the peril has not passed simply because the immediate extremity has braked. And when Sheila insists that Taylor drink water, lifting the glass with shaking hands, the gesture is loaded with contradiction, care wrapped around control, help offered on terms that support prison, and Taylor, though weak, makes a deliberate choice to accept the water without gratefulness, to belt sluggishly, buying time, keeping their movements measured, because indeed in this depleted state the instinct to survive sharpens into strategy, fading that overt defiance could provoke volatility while quiet compliance might produce openings laterally, and Sheila, misunderstanding this restraint as acceptance, allows herself a flicker of relief, telling herself that effects are stabilizing, that she handled the collapse, that this proves she can manage what she has done, yet beneath that relief there's a growing fracture, because part of her knows that she's standing on ground that could give way at any moment, that Taylor's collapse wasn't an anomaly but a warning. And this implied fear leaks out in subtle ways: tensed jaw, pacing way, unforeseen perversity when Taylor winces or closes their eyes for too long, revealing how close Sheila is to the edge of her own abidance, and as hours pass, the dynamic settles into an uneasy meter, Taylor drifting in and out of shallow rest, body sluggishly recovering from shock but mind remaining alert, listing details, sounds, routines, while Sheila oscillates between tyrannous alertness and abrupt pull-out, leaving the room only to return snappily, as if hysterical that absence itself could undo her control, and this oscillation creates a cerebral whiplash that's exhausting in its own right, forcing Taylor to constantly reassess the temperature of the room, to gauge whether the coming commerce will bring gentleness or blameworthiness, and it's in this prolonged pressure that the deeper damage of the hijacking becomes apparent, because the collapse wasn't a single event but the morning of a sustained corrosion, a wearing down of certainty and safety that continues indeed as Taylor regains physical strength, and when Sheila ultimately demands discussion, needs to talk, needs Taylor to hear, to understand why this happened, the imbalance of power becomes stark, because Taylor's silence isn't a turn down to engage but a necessity, a boundary executed by prostration and fear, yet Sheila interprets it as rejection, as thanklessness, as evidence that Taylor does and appreciate how important she has offered, and this misapprehension feeds resentment, stropping her tone, her words taking on an edge that makes the air feel dangerous again, and in these moments Taylor sees easily that the collapse has altered the line of events, because it exposed a vulnerability Sheila cannot completely ignore, but it didn't transfigure her, didn't bring guilt or clarity, only a more complicated interpretation of denial, and this understanding energies a quiet resoluteness in Taylor, a determination that survival must ultimately give way to escape, that enduring this space indefinitely isn't an option, because each hour spent then deepens the cerebral imprint of prison, and as another night approaches, the echoes of the first night loiter, the memory of collapsing still pictorial in Taylor's body, muscles tightening at the study of pushing too far again, while Sheila, seeing the weight of the approaching darkness, grows more restless, as if night itself is and blameworthiness she cannot answer, and when she eventually retreats to another room, leaving Taylor alone for the longest stretch yet, the silence becomes both a trouble and a gift, because it allows Taylor to suppose without interruption, to breathe without being watched, to test the limits of their strength, precisely shifting position, standing with trouble, legs pulsing but holding, and in that small palm there's a spark of stopgap, fragile but real, a memorial that collapse didn't mean defeat, that the body can recover indeed when the mind is scarred, and as Taylor steadies themselves, hearkening for Sheila's steps, the story pivots down from the proximity of the hijacking toward its ineluctable reckoning, because the collapse has formerly set forces in stir that Sheila cannot completely contain, drawing attention inward and outward, leaving traces that will count laterally, and while the outgrowth remains uncertain, one verity has formed in the fate the act of hijacking didn't give Sheila the control she sought. It only revealed how unstable her grasp truly is, and Taylor, though shaken and hurt, carries forward the knowledge that indeed at their weakest moment, indeed on the bottom, breath coming in ragged gasps, commodity within them remained unbroken, watching, flashing back, staying for the moment when abidance can turn into escape, and that quiet, patient mindfulness becomes the real durability of the story, stretching beyond the room, beyond the B&B, beyond Sheila's depraved apologies, toward a future where this collapse is no longer the end of agency but the morning of survival reclaimed. As the alternate night deepens, stretching itself across the walls with a heaviness that feels nearly cognizant, Taylor becomes acutely apprehensive of how prison alters the perception of time, turning twinkles into obstacles and hours into abidance tests, each one demanding to be survived rather than lived, and with Sheila out of the room the silence presses closer, no longer neutral but charged with possibility and threat, because silence in this place can mean safety or it can mean escalation, and Taylor learns to hear to it the way one listens to a held breath, staying for the point at which it breaks, and while fear still hums beneath every steady commodity differently has begun to surface alongside it, a careful, deliberate focus that didn't live before the collapse, a focus stoned by the knowledge that the body failed formerly and might again if pushed recklessly, and so Taylor begins to move with intention rather than impulse, testing muscles sluggishly, resting themselves in physical sensation, noting the pang in their legs not as weakness but as evidence of rotation returning, strength reconditioning in small supplements, and this quiet recalibration becomes an act of resistance in itself, because it refuses to let fear mandate the limits of recovery, and when Sheila ultimately returns, her presence feels different now, heavier, as though the room itself recoils slightly at her entry, and she seems to smell this shift too, scrupling at the threshold before stepping outside, her expression caught between guard and commodity dangerously close to need, because the collapse changed further than the immediate dynamic, it disintegrated the story Sheila had been telling herself, introducing an element she cannot fluently dismiss, and she compensates for this dislocation by tensing her grip on control, asking pointed questions, watching Taylor's movements with new scrutiny, measuring every breath for signs of rebellion or manipulation, and Taylor, apprehensive of this scrutiny, responds by getting designedly normal, answering vocally, moving sluggishly, conserving energy not only physically but emotionally, because every visible response feels like it could be seized and twisted, and this collective alert creates a fragile equilibrium, a stalemate where neither side can act without consequence, and in that space the cerebral weight of the hijacking grows heavier, because without constant extremity to distract them, both are left to defy the reality of what's unfolding, and for Sheila that reality is decreasingly uncomfortable, because the power she imagined would feel stabilizing rather feels precarious, dependent on Taylor's compliance, Taylor's health, Taylor's continued presence, and this dependence frightens her, making her mood sharper, her tolerance thinner, her apologies louder, as though volume might drown out doubt, and when she speaks of the future, of how long this will last, of what she expects from Taylor, the words feel vague, unformed, betraying a lack of true planning beneath the original act, and Taylor notices this, filing it down as another point of influence, another crack in the structure holding them then, and as the night stretches on, prostration pulls at both of them in different ways, Taylor fighting to stay alert, Sheila fighting the creeping consummation that she cannot sustain this indefinitely, and it's in this participated prostration that small, unsettling moments of humanity slip through, moments where Sheila's guard drops just enough to reveal fear rather than imminence, where she confesses query, admits she didn't suppose it would feel like this, and these admissions are dangerous not because they inspire sympathy but because they hang to blur boundaries, to invite emotional labor from someone who has been profoundly wronged, and Taylor responds to these moments with careful impartiality, offering neither comfort nor combination, because engagement feels parlous, and Sheila, seeing this restraint, oscillates again, withdrawing into dispassionateness, also surging back with intensity, as if hopeless to provoke some response that will confirm her applicability, and this emotional volatility reinforces Taylor's understanding that the collapse wasn't simply physical but emblematic, exposing the insecurity at the heart of Sheila's conduct, and as another day begins, marked only by the change in light rather than any true routine, Taylor begins to witness the subtle deformations that dragged prison inflicts, moments where recollections of the outside world feel oddly distant, flattened, as though belonging to another interpretation of themselves, and fading this drift becomes critical, because losing connection to that former tone feels like another kind of collapse, quieter, but no less dangerous. And so Taylor begins to anchor themselves designedly, replaying recollections, reciting details of ordinary life, holding on to names, places, habits, using them as evidence of durability, while Sheila, observing this inward turn, misreads it as pullout, as thanklessness, as evidence that Taylor is slipping away emotionally, and this misunderstanding energizes a new strain of fear. Because Sheila didn't just want possession, she wanted connection on her own terms. Confirmation that her conduct signified, and the absence of that confirmation feels like failure, and failure is commodity she cannot tolerate, and this pressure builds until it spills into battle, not explosive but slice, Sheila demanding acknowledgement, demanding understanding, demanding that Taylor admit this hijacking was ever ineluctable, ever justified, and Taylor, feeling the weight of the demand, recognizes the peril of outright turndown but also the peril of cession. Because agreeing to that narrative would mean surrendering commodity essential, and so Taylor responds with a verity that's careful and deficient, admitting fear, admitting confusion, but refusing to validate the act itself, and this response lands inadequately, because it denies Sheila the forgiveness she seeks, and her response is nippy and bitter, words lashing out, criminating Taylor of manipulation, of thanklessness, of trying to make her the villain, and in that moment Taylor sees easily that Sheila's tone image is the axis around which everything turns, more important to her than Taylor's safety, more important indeed than the consequences she risks, and this clarity, though chilling, is also empowering, because it sharpens Taylor's understanding of the cerebral terrain, revealing what Sheila fears most and what might destabilize her control, and as the battle subsides into another tense quiet, Taylor feels the foreshocks ripple through their body, heart pounding, muscles tight, a memorial that while physical recovery has begun, emotional stress can still spark another collapse if not managed precisely, and this mindfulness tempers any impulse toward reckless defiance, buttressing the need for tolerance, for timing, for strategy, and as days blur together, marked only by subtle shifts in Sheila's routines and moods, Taylor begins to notice patterns, moments when Sheila is more distracted, more inward, more vulnerable, and these moments come. Openings, not for escape yet, but for information gathering, for testing limits, for understanding the measures of this prison, and with each observation Taylor reclaims a small measure of agency, transubstantiating from unresistant and turned into active survivor, and this metamorphosis doesn't go unnoticed, because Sheila senses the shift indeed if she cannot name it, seeing that the balance is changing, that Taylor's collapse didn't break them in the way she anticipated, and this consummation unsettles her deeply, stirring resentment and fear in equal measure, and she responds by oscillating again between restriction and indulgence, tensing controls one day, loosening them the coming, as if doubtful which approach will restore her sense of dominance, and this inconsistency creates cracks wide enough for stopgap to seep through, because inconsistency is the adversary of absolute control, and Taylor clings to this knowledge as another night falls, feeling the weight of prostration but also the quiet strength that comes from abidance, understanding now that collapse wasn't the end but a threshold, a moment where the body forced a reckoning that the mind couldn't avoid, and beyond that threshold lies not resolution but possibility, fragile and uncertain but real, and as Taylor lies awake, hearkening to the house settle around them, they make a silent pledge to themselves, one forged in the fate of shock and fear and pain, that survival wouldn't be incorrect for submission, that recovery wouldn't be incorrect for remission, and that when the moment eventually comes, whether through escape, intervention, or battle, they will carry with them the verity of what happened then, not the softened interpretation Sheila clings to, but the raw reality of a line crossed and the mortal cost of that crossing, and this pledge becomes a quiet source of strength, sustaining Taylor through the long, uncertain durability of prison, because indeed in confinement, indeed under vigilant eyes, the capability to name reality remains an act of resistance, and that resistance, slow and deliberate, is what eventually keeps Taylor from collapsing again, holding them upright not through force but through resoluteness, as the story moves inexorably toward its reckoning.